he rationalizes, develops logical and reasonable sequences to prove to himself that he is a suffering soul. And when his proof is conclusive, he is completely miserable. And this complete misery has about it a nostalgic kind of uniqueness. And we have a competitive attitude in which human beings actually vie with each other as to which one can be the most miserable, gaining a certain distinction from having suffered tremendously. Years ago, we had a group formed. In fact, it was created quite a time ago, but became prominent about 25 years ago, a group dedicated to public confession. These members would rise up in meeting and tell all their sins. It was a little confusing and a bit embarrassing, and did lead to a few lawsuits for slander and defamation of character. But the real cause of consternation was, you would think persons would be reticent to get up and admit the most intimate delinquencies. Instead of this, we found that many of these persons got up and proudly confessed delinquencies which they never had. The only problem came be the competitive instinct to be more delinquent than the previous testifier. Each person who got up had to top all who had gone before him, and took a strange morbid pride in confessing faults that he did not possess. This tendency is part of the same pattern that we mentioned before. The idea that we cultivate negation far more enthusiastically than we do virtues. But this problem of competitive testimony of misery makes a certain importance in life. It causes the individual to feel a kind of significance. And it nearly always arises in a life not adequately occupied with other and more constructive activities. The complainer is nearly always a person whose life is not actively dedicated to some practical purpose. This endless complaining, this constant emphasis upon the evils of things, can be defended. Lots of persons have tried to defend it, making quite an heroic exhibition. But all of these individuals, defending or not defending, but clinging to this attitude, are less effective as persons than those with other attitudes. And we must assume in nature that there is a pattern of rewards and punishments which lie within the psychological and biological structure of man. Instead of assuming that he is punished by some arbitrary penalty in the universe, by some god of compensations, we observe that man is constantly rewarded and punished by the chemical consequences of his own conduct. It therefore has to follow that where nature punishes the individual for an attitude, and it would seem to me that loneliness, sickness, despair, sorrow, and frustration must be regarded as some kinds of punishments, that they are the consequences of actions which nature does not wish to see perpetuated. We have to assume that nature rewards obedience with security. That is, a maximum security under existing conditions, and punishes disobedience with insecurity. As our entire generation is lacking in security, as the average individual is insecure, we must assume that what he is doing, how he is thinking, what he is feeling, these things must be wrong, or they could not be punished by a just natural pattern. and each person must ultimately make an accounting to his own biology. He must face the result of his thinking and his feelings upon the cell structure of his own body, upon the circulation of the blood, upon the vital organs of his body, and upon his nervous system. If these are whipped by his actions and attitudes, then these actions and attitudes cannot be correct. Now, underneath all of this, perhaps, lies a deeper problem, namely that biology and physiology may not have been originally conceived or devised for the purposes to which man has dedicated his life. The individual has gradually become a highly complicated mental, emotional creature. And nature, apparently, regards complication as a fault. Nature does not reward any form of complication. The natural processes are direct and simple. And while we may not understand them all, when we discover a new phase, we are always amazed at its simplicity. Truth is usually overlooked because of its simplicity. So man was created, apparently, for a rather simple kind of life. Now, this does not mean that it was intended that he should be an agrarian to the end of his days, or that his entire psychology was built for the time when he lived in a hut in the forest. This is not true. But it is essentially true that man was not created to sustain the degree of wear and tear which he imposes upon himself. Man was not created with an equipment to maintain him against world wars, atomic bombs, crime waves, and the ambitions of leaders and the tribulations and antagonisms of nations and states. He was not created for such an intensive, negative way of life. Thus, his very so-called advancement, with its continuous emphasis upon tension, pressure, and stress, this so-called advancement is resulting in a serious biological complaint which arises out of the bodies of those persons who have exceeded their own resources in their efforts to live. Thus, the answer must lie in simplification and the conservation of resources, the integration of life upon patterns less intensive, less destructive than those with which we are daily confronted now. Nature is again telling us that our ways of life are subject to penalty because they are wrong. Now, a great group of persons arises in a culture such as ours, proudly proclaiming the things we do, telling us that these various activities, useful or useless, are indications of progress. That if it was not for this dynamic with which we are constantly rattling ourselves to pieces, we would not be the prominent, progressive, up-and-coming people that we are. But are we prominent, progressive, and up-and-coming? As we look around us, it looks more as though we were down and departing in many things. It looks as though we are constantly more concerned as to whether or not our progress can survive. And we wake up with consternation to discover that somebody else discovered the Sputnik. A very grave shock to our egos. And we begin to question whether our present way of life is protecting and preserving the leadership we thought we had. Because in the long run, a world or a generation or a nation or a race of sick people cannot preserve leadership. We cannot rule the world if our own psychic natures are in a state of constant uproar and disintegration. In our own daily and immediate problems, these same rules hold true. We live in a constant tension. We live in an intensity almost beyond our conception.